Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Writing Support Center virtual workshop. My name is Giselle, and today's workshop is titled Writing for Inclusivity Using Gender Inclusive Language. We're going to focus on how to avoid gender language and how to transition to gender inclusive language. Before we begin, I do want to go over a couple ground rules. These are some guidelines we have for all of our workshop, just so that you can get the most out of the workshop. So, in order to do that, you want to make sure that you complete the accompanying activity worksheet. If you haven't already, there is a worksheet available for download where you access this workshop. The worksheet comes in both PDF and Word versions. So, please just select one version. You do not need to fill out both. You can select the a version that you're more comfortable using. So if you prefer PDF, please download that one. Or if you prefer completing assignments in Word, please download that version. You also want to take your time as you go through this workshop. While we can't be together in person, there are perks to a recorded workshop, and that is that you can pause and rewind as you need to. So, if there's ever a concept I'm going over that you need a little bit more time to unpack, you can always pause to take a few moments to think. You can also pause when you complete activities, since it's probably going to take you longer than the allotted few seconds I usually give. With that, I do want to start off by talking about our workshop goals. The first goal is to define gendered language and gender inclusive language so that you know the difference between the two. The second goal is to give examples of nouns, pronouns, and titles that are gendered, and to provide alternatives to those gendered nouns, pronouns, and titles. I also want to help you identify how to make your essays more gender inclusive by avoiding stereotypes. And lastly, you're going to revise an essay to be more gender inclusive in tone and content. So to start, I want to talk about what is gendered language and why should you switch to gender inclusive language. In short, gendered language it used to be more normalized. So you might have encountered documents that use masculine nouns and pronouns to refer to groups that include more than men. A very famous and common example of this is the Declaration of Independence, the famous line, "All men are created equal." Obviously, that line today has a different meaning than when it was written. Way back when. Um, but using men to refer to both men, women, and non binary individuals, um, it's no longer seen as gender neutral. Gender language is also presented in how we refer to others with pronouns and titles. So, for example, we tend to assume someone's gender and thus use pronouns and titles according to those assumptions. That's also another version of gendered language. So, gendered language is very common. It's something we engage in all the time. And it's something that recently academia is trying to unlearn and replace with a more gender neutral, gender inclusive language. Like I said, men is not gender neutral. While the word men used to be commonly taught to include both men and women when used, language has changed, and we now acknowledge that the word man is not synonymous with person. Um, as such, writing, like I said, has become more inclusive of women, non binary, and trans individuals. So there are many people who identify outside of the traditional male female binary, and writing should really reflect the experience of all people, and it should be inclusive of all genders. So that's why it's really necessary that we begin to switch over to gender inclusive language in order to be more mindful of people who don't identify as man or woman, or even to be more inclusive of women, since the word man traditionally leaves women out. It's also the new standard. So, gender neutral language has become standard practice in journalistic and academic writing. And this is true for many different academic disciplines. So if you're writing MLA, APA, or Chicago, chances are that that is already the standard for those uh, disciplines of writing. So you're not only being academically correct when you write in a gender inclusive way, you're also being mindful and inclusive of other individuals that are not men. I wanted to review some common gendered nouns. So there's a lot of things in our daily language that is just gendered, and some things that we might not even realize are gendered. Man and words ending in man are the most commonly used gendered nouns in English. So luckily, these words are easy to spot and replace with gender neutral language. But there is also no need to refer to gender unless it's necessary for the content of a sentence. So that's something else to keep in mind, that yes, while you can go through your writing and replace instances where you write man or instances where you are not gender inclusive, however, you don't really need to refer to gender if it's not necessary for the content of whatever you're writing. Um, like I said, there's a lot of ways to avoid using man. Sometimes writers they modify nouns that refer to jobs or positions to indicate the sex of the person that's holding that position. This happens most often when the sex of the person goes against conventional expectations. So, for example, some people might assume maybe like unconsciously without realizing it that doctors are men and women are nurses. Um, so you might see that present itself in writing. So someone might write, the female doctor walked into the room. When something like that is written, there's no reason to refer to the doctor's gender. And that's what I mean when it's not necessary for the content of the sentence. You don't necessarily need to write in the person's gender because it might reveal a stereotype. Because if you assume that doctors are usually men, you might want to put woman doctor to clarify that it's a woman who's a doctor. However, like I said, that could reveal some stereotyping and that women usually aren't doctors. So it's best to just avoid putting gender if it's not necessary for the content of the sentence. However, if that person's identity is necessary for the content of the sentence, then you can include that. For example, if you want to say some women feel more comfortable seeing a woman gynecologist, that would be a place where you could use gendered language because it's necessary for the content of the sentence. But otherwise, the best thing to do is just avoid it altogether if you don't need to do it. Some examples of where man is used is man, right? So that, like I said, that's a word that's commonly used. However, you can replace it with something like person or individual. The word freshman, very common. We still use it when we refer to students in high school, freshmen, sophomores, right? However, you can just say first year student. Man made, you could use something like machine made, synthetic, artificial. Mailman, I hear that one a lot. I think that one's very common. You could use mail carrier or postal worker instead. Actor or actress, it's more common now to just use actor to refer to both. It's gender neutral. Congressman, legislator, congressional representative are both adequate replacements. You could also say senator if you know if that person's a senator, or a representative if they are part of the House of Representatives. Steward and stewardess, I feel like that's an older term. I don't hear it as much, but flight attendant is the more gender neutral term. Another thing I think is commonly used is the word guys when referring to a group, especially here in California. I myself am guilty of using the word guys when referring to a group, and it's a habit I am actively trying to unlearn. But if you look at the image on the left on this slide, there's a bunch of different ways that you can refer to a group without using the word guys. So you could say something like y'all. I see that much more often now. You could use folks. You could use team. You could use any of these fun alternatives from this graph. However, it's just important to be mindful when you are referring to a group. It tends to be gendered male whenever we refer to groups. So it's always important to just be mindful of how you are gendering a group or just gendering um, a role, things like that. So just keep these alternatives in mind, and they might be helpful for your everyday speech or even your writing. So, before we go further, I just want you to take a moment to reflect. So, you've gotten some examples of gendered language. So, now I want you to reflect on gendered language that you may use in writing or even speech, whether it be in your essays, through text messages, or an email, or on social media. What words do you tend to use that are gendered? And what are some alternatives you can use to replace them? If you already actively practice gender inclusive language and writing, what influenced you to make the switch? So go ahead and answer that reflective question. It is the first question on your worksheet. And once you're done answering that reflection question, you can go ahead and continue with the workshop. Okay, so I hope you had enough time to reflect. If not, please continue pausing and continue the workshop once you're done reflecting. All right, so we're going to continue talking about different versions of gendered language and how they present themselves in other areas of our speech and writing. One place where gendered language presents itself is titles. So often, Mr., Miss, and Mrs. are examples of gendered language. Mr. can refer to any man, regardless of whether he is single or married, but Miss and Mrs. define women by whether they are married, which until quite recently meant defining them by their relationships with men. So even with the use of Miss and Mrs., it's still connected to men. A simple alternative when referring to women is to just use Ms., MS, instead of Mrs. or Miss to define whether or not they're married, because it doesn't indicate marital status. Another thing about titles too is some college students are in the habit of addressing older women as Mrs., assuming that they're married, um, and younger women as Miss. So when doing that, like I said, it does a lot of assumptions. Just because someone is older does not mean they're married. And you want to avoid assuming Mrs. or Miss. So that's why when referring to female faculty at the college, you want to default to Ms., MS when you talk to them, or professor or doctor if they have a PhD or doctorate. Those are better gender neutral alternatives rather than assuming if your instructor is married or not. Another place where gendered language shows itself is in names. Writers sometimes refer to women using only their first names in contexts where they would typically refer to men by their full names, including last names and titles. Um, Using only a person's first name is more informal and it can suggest a lack of respect. So, in situations where you would refer to a man by his full title, you should also do the same for a woman or a non binary person. So, for example, in academic writing, we don't refer to William Shakespeare as Will or William. Typically, writers will refer to him as William Shakespeare. So, if you're writing about a female author, you want to make sure you're also writing about her by her full name and not shortening it. Um, Another example of this, a more recent example, is during one of the presidential debates, the moderator referred to Kamala Harris as Kamala instead of Senator Harris. And the whole debate, she was referring to Vice President Pence as Vice President Pence. So the moderator had to slip up and called Senator Harris Kamala. And it just kind of showed. It suggested a lack of respect, so the moderator immediately corrected herself and said, "Excuse me, Senator Harris." So it's really important. You see these things in, in on TV and in articles and everywhere, where women and men are referred to in different ways. It's just interesting as you pay more attention to it. And it's something to be mindful of in your own writing so that you're giving respect to equally to both men, women, and non binary individuals. Another place where gendered language often reveals itself is in pronouns. And there's a lot of ways where you can avoid this. So instead of assuming someone's gender by referring to them as he, him, or she, her, there's a few ways that you can avoid doing this, especially in your writing. So when writing, and you don't know the person's pronouns, you can use more than one pronoun. So, an example of this is using he slash she or saying he or she. So, one example of a sentence that would use this is when the student spoke to the instructor during office hours, he slash she felt better. Now, there are pros and cons to each one of these methods. Um, and the con of this method, I would say, is that you do not provide an option for a non-binary person. So if you use he or she, it immediately assumes that the person falls into traditional categories of gender. And you want to, I personally don't like the he or she usage. Another con that might happen is that if you're doing it in an essay, using he or she all throughout the essay might get a little bulky, and it might add a lot of extra words that might affect the flow of your paper. Like I said, it is something that you can use if you know that person is either male or female, but it is one alternative in your writing to use, just using he or she or he slash she. Another way that you can avoid using gendered language is to alternate genders and pronouns. This one's a little bit different and it's very situation specific. Um, it can also be a little stylistically awkward, depending on what you're using it for. So a good place that you could use alternating genders and pronouns is if you know that both men and women are using whatever the service that you're talking about, or um, it really only applies to like a scenario type of writing response. So, for example, you could write something like, ask her to describe her purpose and audience and show how she has taken them into account in her writing. Respond as a reader, explaining what you were thinking as you read his text so that he can discover what a reader might struggle with in his writing. So, this option only works, like I said, in certain situations, usually when you're talking about hypothetical situations. Um, in which both men and women are using that service. However, it can get really confusing if you're doing it in an essay, especially if your reader doesn't quite understand that both men and women might use this service. But it is something that you can do if you do want to enter alternate genders and pronouns, but it might read a little clunky in an essay, and it might be better if you're writing say hypothetical situations or a manual for someone to read through where both men and women are included in that situation. So that's another strategy that you can use to avoid using gendered language. The third strategy is to try making the nouns and pronouns plural. So instead of using a singular pronoun or noun, you can just make the whole sentence plural. So instead of saying something like, the student who lost too much sleep might have trouble focusing on her exams, you can just make it plural by saying students who lose too much sleep may have trouble focusing during their exams. So, making the sentence plural is one way to get past um, gendering someone or a group of people with a singular pronoun. The fourth strategy I have is to use they as a singular pronoun. This is my preferred method when writing in a gender inclusive fashion because it's the least confusing and the least clunky way to refer to everyone in an inclusive way. They is more common in speech and it's newer to writing, but it's becoming more popular to use. Some people are going to argue that they is grammatically incorrect, but be wary of this argument as it could be seen as transphobic. This is because there are individuals who are non binary and use the they pronoun. Merriam Webster Dictionary, the Washington Post Style Guide, and the Oxford Dictionary all recognize singular they as a gender neutral pronoun. So it is actually grammatically correct according to these style guides. An example of a sentence that uses they would be they enjoy studying in the library with the other students from their class. So, my strongest suggestion is if you do not know the gender of someone or the gender of an individual you're writing about, just use they um, instead of using one of the other three strategies I provided. But all of these strategies are gender inclusive, so you can use them. But like I said, each one has pros and cons. So, one question I've heard is what if I'm not sure of someone's gender? You might find yourself sometimes needing to refer to a person whose gender you're not sure of. Maybe you're writing a paper about the creator of an ancient text or a piece of art, and you don't know the gender of that artist or that author. For example, Beowulf, they don't know the gender of the poet that wrote Beowulf. So that's one instance where you might not know someone's gender and you're writing an essay. Another place where you might not know someone's gender is on a discussion board. So this could be on Canvas or it could be other discussion boards that you participate in your everyday life. So Reddit, whatever it may be. Maybe you don't know that person's gender. That's another situation where you might know. You could also be writing about someone you don't know personally whose name is not really clearly associated with a particular gender. So, gender neutral names like Sam um, might not be clear to you whether or not this person is male, female, or non binary. So, you might want to use gender inclusive pronouns and nouns in that situation as well. Maybe this person has a name from a language you're not sure of. Perhaps it's a Chinese name, or perhaps it's a European name, or perhaps it's a Latinx name, and you just don't know the gender because you're not aware of that culture. Um, that's another situation where you might not know the gender of the person. Um, so there's a bunch of situations where you might not know someone's gender. So what do you do? One strategy is to refer to the person using a descriptive word or phrase. So if you're writing about Beowulf, for example, you could just say the Beowulf poet or simply the poet or the author and avoid using pronouns. Another way is to keep using their name if you do know it, rather than substituting it for a he or she pronoun. So, example, blogger Sam Smith's cats have apparently destroyed couches, stolen sandwiches, and terrorized their human and canine housemates. There's no pronouns in that sentence, but the author referred to the person as their by their name so that they could avoid using pronouns. You could also do research. So, if you are writing about an author or other public figure, you'll most likely find work where other writers have referred to the person by the appropriate pronouns. Um, so, you can also do that if you're unsure. Or if you're in a situation where you have to interview someone for a paper or an assignment, you can share your pronouns to help them feel comfortable and or allow them to self-identify. So sharing your pronouns has become much more common. You might see this over Zoom or Canvas. There's an option where you can put your pronouns in your biography. And in Zoom, you can put your pronouns in your name. But sharing your pronouns might make it uh, might make the situation more comfortable for others who are non-binary or transgender, to share their pronouns. So sharing your pronouns is one strategy to make the situation more comfortable for someone who might be apprehensive about sharing theirs. So that's one step to getting more gender inclusive. But the next step is to allow them to self identify. So if you're unsure of how to address a person's gender or sexual identity when writing content, such as a feature article, simply ask, are there any aspects of your identity that you would like to share in this article? It's their choice to self identify, and you never want to identify an individual as a member of the LGBTQ community without their permission. So never assume someone's gender and never force them to reveal that information to you if it's not something that they're comfortable with. All you can do is try to make the situation comfortable so that they feel like they can share with you. If all else fails, default to they, them. Again, that is a gender neutral pronoun, and it's the easiest way to refer to everyone in a manner that's equitable and inclusive. So, what about the content of your paper? How can you make that more gender inclusive outside of just changing gendered language, pronouns, nouns, names, titles? How can you do that beyond changing those, making those changes? Um, there's some questions you can ask yourself to make sure that your content is gender inclusive. So, one question you can ask is, how are you describing individuals in your writing? So, for example, when writing about women, do you tend to focus more on their physicality and appearance, even when it's not relevant to the content? Like I said earlier, you don't need to refer to gender unless it's relevant to your argument or the content you're writing about. Um, being aware of how you write about men and women and non binary individuals might reveal if your writing is gendered or relying on gendered stereotypes. So just ask yourself, are you writing about people in a way that's stereotypical based on their gender? So that's one thing that you can ask whenever writing an essay. Um, Another question you can ask yourself is, how are you writing about relationships and roles? When you write about certain roles, do you tend to assume that this applies to a certain gender more than others? Um, for example, if you're writing about family leave, are you only thinking about how this applies to women who have children? Or are you considering non binary people or men and how they might be impacted by family leave? Sometimes we just assume certain roles based on how we've been raised or the kind of messaging we've been getting. And we fail to recognize things outside of gendered stereotypes. Another thing that I think of is a riddle. The riddle is, father and son are badly hurt in a car accident. And when they're taken to the hospital, the doctor says, I can't do surgery. This is my son. And the question is, how is this possible? And sometimes people will answer, I don't know. Um, Maybe this person has two fathers, right? But the answer to the riddle is that the doctor is the child's mother. And what it reveals about certain individuals is that perhaps they have a gendered stereotype about doctors being men, which is hard for them to recognize that this doctor might be the son's mother. Um, so it's things like that where how are you writing about certain roles, and are you assuming people in those roles based on their gender? Overall, assumptions about gender do weaken arguments. In college writing, you are asked to provide an analysis and make an evidence based argument. Readers will critique your argument by assessing the values and assumptions your claims rely on. So, using gendered language and assumptions might translate to bias, overgeneralization, or incomplete knowledge. So, it's really important that you critically examine the role that gender has played in your decisions about the content in your paper, because it can make your writing stronger and make your arguments more effective. It's also going to make your writing more persuasive to a bigger variety of readers. Um, no matter what position you take on a topic. So it doesn't matter what the writing in your paper is about, but if you make sure that you're not relying on stereotypes or describing individuals based on their gender, you will have a stronger argument because it will eliminate bias and overgeneralization. So, this is the final activity for this workshop, and it's a checklist for gender inclusive revision. So, for this activity, you're going to review an essay you're currently working on or an essay you completed in the past. I want you to read over the paper for gender inclusive language. As you review and revise your paper, consider the following checklist. One, have you used man or men or words containing them to refer to people who may not be men? Question mark. Have you used he, him, his, or himself to refer to people who may not be men? If you have mentioned someone's sex or gender, was it necessary to do so? Do you use any occupational or other stereotypes? And lastly, do you provide the same kinds of information in descriptions when writing about people of different genders? So, after you've reviewed and revised your paper, consider the revisions you made and the reflection on your worksheet. Did you catch any of the items from the checklist? How might revising your paper for gender inclusive language improve your argument? So go ahead and do that. Revise your paper. Like I said, a paper that you've already written or a paper you're writing. And after you've done that, reflect on your worksheet. You can resume the video after you've done that. So go ahead and pause here. All right, so I hope you had enough time. If not, continue pausing and continue once you've completed your revision. I did include a small image here just as a reminder of how to use gender inclusive language. So instead of his or hers, use theirs. Ladies and gentlemen, you can use something like distinguished guests. Men or women, you could use everyone. Lady slash man in the red shirt, you can refer to someone as a person, and like I said, guys, which is something I'm guilty of using you can use folks. So this is just a little closing reminder as we wrap up this workshop. Some of the works cited from this workshop are the Gender Inclusive Language handout from the Writing Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. If you've seen my workshops before, I use a lot of their materials, very helpful. Highly recommend their website if you do have other writing questions. We also have an article from the University of Idaho called the Inclusive Writing Guide, which I also got some of the information from this workshop from. Both great resources if you do want to learn more about how to write inclusively. Lastly, I do want to say it is Trans Awareness Week. So this workshop is coming out at the perfect time. I hope you found it helpful. If you have any more questions on how to be more gender inclusive in your writing, you can always come to the Writing Center. To do so, just go to our website, Writing Support Center. At Pasadena City College, you can Google it and it'll take you to our website. And on there, you'll see a Meet with a Tutor button. If you click on that, it'll take you directly to our Zoom room where you can meet with one of our tutors. Like I said, I hope you found this workshop helpful and I hope to see you for the next one.